The morning light crept slowly over the town of Maple Grove, a quiet little place tucked between the misty hills of Pennsylvania. The streets were nearly empty, except for the sound of an occasional passing car and the gentle ringing of church bells from St. Mary's down the road. The town had a certain peace to it, the kind that made time feel slower, softer. You could still smell bread baking from the old corner bakery, and neighbors waved when they saw each other at the mailbox. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, but even here, behind drawn curtains and quiet walls, pain had a way of hiding itself. Inside a small white house at the end of Willow Lane lived Thomas Ellery, a man whose life had once been filled with noise, the sound of hammering nails, the laughter of his wife, the creak of wood as he built something from nothing. Now, all that remained was silence. Thomas lay in a hospital bed that had been placed by the living room window, so he could still see the world outside. He liked watching the wind move through the trees. It reminded him that something was still alive, even if he didn't feel that way anymore. He was 72 years old. His hair was white now, and his once steady hands trembled when he tried to lift a glass of water. His skin had grown thin and pale, his voice soft and dry. On the table beside his bed sat a half-finished Bible, a pair of glasses, and a photograph of a smiling woman holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Her name was Evelyn, his wife of 40 years, gone now, 3 years past. Her absence was the kind of ache that didn't fade, it only changed shape. Some days, it was sharp and sudden. Other days, it was a dull heaviness that sat in his chest like a stone. He often talked to her picture. "You tell me to keep fighting," he whispered once. "But I'm so tired, Eve. So very tired." The cancer had taken everything from him, his work, his energy, his sense of purpose. The doctors had said there was nothing more they could do. He'd stopped asking questions after that. Each day looked the same: morning light, pain medicine, the soft hum of the oxygen machine, and the long, quiet hours between one sunset and the next. He had stopped praying weeks ago. There had been a time, years ago, when Thomas never missed a Sunday service. He'd built the wooden pews in St. Mary's with his own hands. He'd once believed deeply that God heard every prayer, every whisper. But illness has a way of wearing faith thin, like old fabric stretched too many times. Now, when people from church came to visit, he smiled politely but turned his eyes to the window. They prayed over him, placed hands on his shoulder, said words like healing, hope, and miracle. Thomas didn't believe in miracles anymore. He had lost one long before his diagnosis, the miracle of reconciliation. His son, Michael, hadn't spoken to him in 22 years. The argument that drove them apart wasn't about anything extraordinary. It was about money, pride, and words said in anger. But sometimes the smallest cracks become chasms when hearts stay hardened. Thomas had wanted to make things right once, but years passed, and stubbornness took the place of love. Then Evelyn died, and his will to reach out died with her. Now, in the quiet hours of his illness, the memories haunted him: his son's laughter as a boy, the smell of sawdust in the workshop, the sound of Michael's voice calling, "Dad," across the yard. He tried not to think about those days. But loneliness is a cruel companion, it brings back what you'd rather forget. Every night, as the oxygen machine hissed softly beside him, Thomas whispered a final thought before sleep. "Maybe this is the day I won't wake up." And each morning, when the sun broke through the curtains again, he felt a strange disappointment that he was still here. But something was stirring far away, something he didn't know about. 2 towns over, in a small apartment above a hardware store, his son Michael sat at a kitchen table, stirring his coffee. He was 45 now, with lines on his face that made him look older than his years. He had a wife and a teenage daughter who barely knew her grandfather existed. Every morning before work, he said a quiet prayer, not because he knew if it made a difference, but because he didn't know what else to do. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't know how to fix what's broken. But please, take care of him." He hadn't said his father's name in years, yet every morning, the same prayer found its way to heaven, gentle, consistent, unspoken in the spaces between his words. And maybe, just maybe, heaven had been listening all along. Back in Maple Grove, autumn continued to drift toward winter. Leaves gathered in piles against fences, the wind grew colder, and the nights stretched longer. Thomas had stopped keeping track of the days. His nurse, Clara, visited twice a day, a kind woman from church who still believed in miracles. She'd bring soup, adjust his blanket, and talk to him as if he were just resting from a long day's work. He liked her. She reminded him of his daughter-in-law, though he'd never met her. Sometimes, she'd read to him from the Psalms. Other times, she'd hum hymns under her breath while she tidied the room. It was the only music left in his life. One evening, as she helped him sit up to eat, she said quietly, "Mr. Ellery, do you ever think about going back to church?" He gave a weak smile. "I think God's had enough of me, Clara." Her eyes softened. "Or maybe he's waiting for you to come back." He didn't answer. He didn't want to cry in front of her. After she left, he looked out the window. The sky was dim, streaked with fading light. Somewhere far away, the church bell rang 6 times. He closed his eyes, remembering Evelyn's voice when she prayed before dinner, simple words, full of warmth. "Lord, thank you for another day. Help us love each other well." He wished he'd listened more back then. He drifted into sleep as the wind whispered through the trees, unaware that something unseen was already moving, not in the hospital halls, not in medicine, but in the quiet corridors of grace. Because while Thomas had stopped believing, God had not stopped watching. And somewhere between heaven and Maple Grove, a prayer, whispered by a son he hadn't seen in decades, began to move mountains no one could see yet. Rain came softly that afternoon, not the kind that falls in torrents, but a slow, steady drizzle that seemed to wash the color out of the world. The sky was the color of pewter, and the wind carried the faint smell of wet leaves and earth. Inside the house on Willow Lane, Thomas Ellery stirred in his bed, awakened by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windowpane. His chest hurt. It was a deep, tired ache, not sharp like it used to be, but heavy, as though every breath cost him something precious. He turned his head toward the sound of footsteps. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ellery," came Clara's gentle voice. She stepped inside, shaking droplets from her umbrella. Her hair was slightly damp, her cheeks pink from the cold. In her hands was a tray, a bowl of soup, a slice of bread, and a small folded napkin. "You should try to eat," she said softly, setting the tray beside him. "Just a few spoonfuls." Thomas managed a faint smile. "You're persistent, Clara." "It's my job," she teased lightly. He stared at the soup for a long while, then shook his head. "It's no use. I can't keep it down. The pain's worse today." She hesitated, looking at him, not as a nurse, but as someone who cared deeply. "Then let's not talk about the pain," she said. "Tell me something good instead. Something you miss." He closed his eyes. A small, nostalgic sigh escaped his lips. "I miss the smell of sawdust," he said after a pause. "Used to fill my workshop every morning. I built tables, chairs, little wooden boxes for Evelyn's flowers. Everything had purpose back then. And now? Now I'm just waiting." The words hung in the air like fog. Clara looked at him, eyes full of empathy. "Then maybe," she said softly, "you should start waiting with hope again." Thomas didn't answer. He just turned his face toward the window. Outside, raindrops streaked the glass like tiny rivers, catching faint glimmers of light. That night, after she left, the house was silent except for the sound of the rain. Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the stillness press in around him. He couldn't shake Clara's words. Waiting with hope. What did that even mean anymore? Hope was something he'd buried long ago, somewhere between Evelyn's funeral and the doctor's quiet sigh when he said the word terminal. He reached for his Bible, the one that had sat unopened for months, its cover worn soft with time. He opened it to the middle, where the thin pages fell naturally, Psalm 34. His eyes moved slowly across the lines. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." He stopped reading. His throat tightened. It felt like those words were written just for him. Tears came suddenly, uninvited. He hadn't cried in years. He whispered into the quiet. God. I don't know if you still listen to men like me. But if you do, please. Show me you're still here. The rain seemed to hush for a moment, as though the whole world had paused to listen. But nothing else happened. No thunder, no light from heaven. Just silence, and the ticking of the clock on the wall. He waited, half expecting some divine response, but all he heard was the whisper of his own breath. Finally, exhausted, he closed his eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. That's when it happened. Sometime after midnight, he woke with a start, not from pain, not from the oxygen machine's hum, but from a voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't human. It was inside him. A single word. Soft, steady, clear. Forgive. He sat upright, heart pounding. The room was still. The lamp glowed faintly, casting long shadows on the walls. He looked around, half convinced someone was there. Who's there? He rasped. No answer. Only that same gentle whisper inside his chest. Forgive. He pressed his hands to his face, trembling. Forgive? Forgive who? And then he knew. He whispered the name he hadn't said aloud in more than 2 decades. Michael. The sound of it broke something inside him, like the first crack in a frozen river before the thaw. He remembered the argument, the slammed door, the angry words that could never be taken back. He remembered the silence that followed, year after year of it. Pride had been his shield, and loneliness had been the price. He wept. For the first time since Evelyn's death, he truly wept, deep, shaking sobs that came from a place beyond pain. It felt like every hardened piece of his heart was finally breaking open. When morning came, Clara found him sitting up, a faint smile on his face. His eyes were red, but peaceful, like someone who had wrestled through a long night and come out the other side. You look different, she said softly. He nodded slowly. Maybe I am. I asked God for a sign last night. And I think he gave me one. He didn't tell her about the voice. Some things are too sacred to explain. Instead, he asked for something unexpected. Clara, he said, would you help me write a letter? She tilted her head. A letter? To my son. She smiled faintly. Of course. And that's how it began, with a single trembling hand, a blank sheet of paper, and a prayer that was slowly finding its way home. As Clara guided his pen, Thomas spoke slowly, the words spilling out between breaths. My son. I don't have much time left. I don't remember how we let anger become our master, but I remember loving you before that. If you can, come home. When they finished, Clara folded the letter gently and placed it in an envelope. Thomas looked at it for a long moment. You sure you want me to mail this? She asked. He nodded. I've wasted too many years already. As she left to post it, he whispered under his breath. Lord, if this is my last prayer, let it reach him. Outside, the rain began to lighten. The clouds drifted apart, revealing a narrow band of sunlight breaking through, thin but steady. He stared at it through the window, eyes full of quiet awe. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest, something fragile but unmistakable. Hope. The rain stopped 2 days later, and for the first time in weeks, sunlight touched the porch of the little house on Willow Lane. Clara had already mailed the letter, and Thomas had spent those days in silence, waiting, thinking, remembering. The world outside seemed more alive now. He noticed things he hadn't noticed in months, the sound of birds in the maple tree, the creak of the floor when Clara walked across the room, even the faint hum of passing cars. Each sound reminded him that life still went on, with or without him. He didn't know if Michael would ever read the letter. He didn't even know if it would reach him. But somehow, it didn't matter anymore. Writing it had already begun to heal something deep within him. That morning, Clara found him gazing out the window, a faint light in his tired eyes. You're up early, she said gently. Couldn't sleep, Thomas replied. Feels like something's shifting. She smiled. Maybe your prayer's been heard. He nodded, almost afraid to believe it. Far away, 3 towns over, the letter arrived at Michael Ellery's doorstep. It was a Thursday morning, gray skies, cool breeze, and the usual hum of traffic outside his apartment. Michael had just finished shaving when his daughter, Emily, called from the kitchen. "Dad! There's something in the mail for you. Looks old." He walked over, towel over his shoulder. And there it was, a small, cream-colored envelope with shaky handwriting. His breath caught the moment he saw the name, Thomas Ellery. His father's hand. He'd have recognized it anywhere. For a long moment, he couldn't move. 22 years of silence pressed down on him all at once. Memories flooded in, his father's stern voice, the arguments, the final slammed door. "You okay, Dad?" Emily asked, concern in her eyes. "Yeah," he murmured. "Just surprised." He took the envelope to the table, sat down slowly, and opened it with trembling hands. The paper inside was thin, creased at the edges. He began to read. "My son. I don't have much time left. I don't remember how we let anger become our master, but I remember loving you before that. If you can, come home. Dad." Michael's eyes blurred. He set the paper down, pressed his palms over his face, and let out a deep, shaking breath. His wife, Lisa, entered quietly, saw the letter, and put a hand on his shoulder. "From your father?" she asked softly. He nodded. "After all these years? What will you do?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, watching the clouds move across the sky. His heart felt heavy, conflicted, resentment and longing tangled together like roots under the soil. "I don't know," he whispered. "Part of me wants to go. Part of me's still angry." Lisa squeezed his shoulder gently. "Then maybe that's exactly why you should go." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he prayed out loud. "God, I don't even know how to do this. But if you're giving me a chance to make things right, don't let me waste it." That night, a storm rolled in. The sky rumbled with thunder as Michael packed a small bag. Emily watched quietly from the hallway. "Are you going to see Grandpa?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah. It's time." She hugged him before he left. "Tell him I said hi." As he drove away, lightning split the sky, and rain began to pour. The road stretched long and winding through the Pennsylvania countryside, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. His heart pounded with every mile, not from fear, but from the weight of what waited ahead. The past 22 years replayed in his mind like an old film, his father's voice calling him stubborn, his own pride shouting back, the day he walked away and never looked back. Every mile closer felt like walking toward a ghost. Meanwhile, back in Maple Grove, Thomas couldn't sleep. The clock read 11:47 p.m. He felt a stirring in his chest, not pain this time, but something else. Expectation. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes were bright. He whispered softly, "If you meant what you said, Lord, if forgive was truly from you, then give me the strength to see it through." A few minutes later, a faint sound broke the silence, tires crunching over wet gravel. Thomas turned his head toward the window. Headlights. A car stopping in the driveway. Clara wasn't due until morning. His heart raced. The door opened slowly. The sound of rain followed someone inside. Then a familiar voice, older, lower, but unmistakable. "Dad?" Thomas froze. For a heartbeat, he thought he was dreaming. His lips trembled. He turned his head toward the doorway. And there stood Michael, soaked from the rain, eyes glistening, face pale with emotion. For a long moment, neither spoke. The years between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by the sound of rain dripping from his son's coat onto the wooden floor. Then Thomas whispered, "Son, is it really you?" Michael nodded, voice breaking. "It's me, Dad." Thomas's hand reached out, weak, shaking, but open. Michael crossed the room in 2 steps and took it, falling to his knees beside the bed. They stayed like that for what felt like forever, no words, just tears. Tears that carried 22 years of pride, regret, and longing. Finally, Thomas spoke through trembling lips. "I thought I'd never see you again." Michael shook his head. "I should have come sooner. I was waiting for you to call." Thomas gave a faint, weary smile. "So was I, guess we were both too proud for too long." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that hurts because it's mixed with sorrow. Then, almost without thinking, Michael said, "Can I pray with you?" Thomas's eyes filled again. "Please." Michael knelt beside the bed, bowed his head, and began. "Father, thank you for this moment. For giving us another chance. Forgive us for the years we wasted. Help us forgive each other, and ourselves." Thomas whispered the last part with him, voice fragile, but sure. "As we forgive each other." When they opened their eyes, the room was filled with stillness, not the silence of emptiness, but the peace of presence. The rain had stopped outside, and through the window, a soft silver moonlight spilled across the floor. Thomas reached out, resting his hand over his son's. "That's all I wanted," he said quietly. "Just this." Michael nodded, unable to speak. He stayed by his father's side long after midnight, their hands still clasped. At one point, Thomas's breathing grew shallow, his eyelids heavy. "You should rest, Dad," Michael whispered. Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe I will. Maybe I already am." His eyes closed. His breathing slowed. Michael watched, heart pounding, unsure if this was the moment, if this was goodbye. But then, Thomas's chest rose again, gently, peacefully. He was asleep. Still holding his son's hand. Outside, dawn began to rise, quiet and pale, over the town of Maple Grove. The morning light that filtered through the hospital blinds was soft, pale gold, the kind of light that felt like mercy. The machines around Thomas hummed quietly, steady, calm, unlike the chaos of the night before. Nurse Clara entered with her usual quiet grace, but today her eyes held a kind of awe she couldn't hide. Thomas was sitting up. His color had returned faintly to his cheeks. His breathing, no longer the gasping struggle it once was, flowed evenly. A gentle strength had replaced the weariness in his face. He whispered, voice still rough but clear, "Clara, I dreamed of light. I saw a river, and I heard someone say, 'Go back, your prayer is heard.'" Clara froze. She'd seen small improvements before, but not like this. She rushed to check his vitals, everything was stabilizing. You're getting stronger," she said softly, her voice trembling. Thomas smiled faintly. "No, not stronger, just finally at peace." Outside, the winter sun rose higher, glinting off the snow, turning the world into a field of gold. And as the hours passed, word of Thomas's sudden recovery began to ripple through the ward. Doctors came in, confused but cautious. "It's remarkable," one of them murmured. "Medically, there's no clear explanation for this turnaround." But Clara didn't need a chart to tell her what she already knew. Something holy had brushed against that room. Across town, in a small wooden church where the candles were still burning from the night before, Michael knelt alone. He hadn't been able to sleep. The memory of his prayer, that trembling, desperate cry, kept replaying in his mind. He whispered again, "Lord, if you can hear me, please, let him live. Please." And just then, his phone buzzed. It was Clara. "Michael," she said, her voice breaking. "Your father's awake." He froze, unable to speak. Tears filled his eyes before he could even form a word. When he arrived at the hospital, Thomas was sitting up, looking toward the window where light poured in like a promise kept. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, father and son, both with tear-streaked faces, both speechless. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I heard you, son. I heard your prayer." Michael shook his head, choking back emotion. No, you didn't. You were gone, Dad. I just prayed. Thomas reached out, his frail hand trembling but certain. I didn't mean with my ears. I heard it in here. He pressed his hand to his chest. When you prayed, something changed. Not just in me. In both of us. The next days became a gentle miracle. Thomas grew stronger, and though the doctors still called it unexplainable, everyone in that ward felt something had happened, something that couldn't be captured in any report. Clara, standing by the doorway one evening, whispered a quiet prayer herself. Thank you, Lord, for reminding us that faith is never wasted. And for Michael, those days became a sacred rhythm, sitting beside his father, reading scripture aloud, holding his hand in silence. They didn't talk much about the years of distance or the guilt that once weighed between them. The silence itself became forgiveness. One night, Thomas looked up at his son and said softly, Michael, if I don't wake up one of these days, don't let this miracle die with me. Tell someone, tell them prayer still works. Michael nodded, tears glimmering in his eyes. I will, Dad. I promise. Thomas smiled, the faintest trace of light in his eyes. Then my life has already been healed. That night, the snow fell again, quiet, endless, pure. But in the little hospital room, it wasn't a night of sorrow. It was peace. The monitors continued their gentle rhythm, and the air seemed almost alive with something unseen, as if heaven itself had leaned close to listen. And in that stillness, the lesson took shape, not about escaping death, but about discovering that faith can breathe life into what seems beyond saving. There are moments in life when prayer feels like shouting into the dark, when every word seems to disappear into silence. But sometimes, silence is just God listening. Michael would never forget that night, the one when his voice trembled over his dying father's hospital bed. He didn't know what words to use. He didn't even know if they mattered. But he spoke from a place deeper than fear, the place where faith still flickers, even when everything else fades. And that was enough. Because faith isn't always about moving mountains. Sometimes it's about surviving the night while you wait for morning. It's about believing that, even in your weakness, heaven hears you. Thomas's recovery became more than a medical surprise, it became a living testimony. Not just that prayer changes circumstances, but that prayer changes people. His heart grew stronger, yes. But so did Michael's. The bitterness that once separated them melted in the warmth of grace. The pain became purpose. The silence between them became peace. Months later, when Thomas finally went home to be with the Lord, not in sickness, but in calm surrender, Michael didn't weep in despair. He smiled through his tears, whispering the same words his father once told him. When you prayed, something changed in both of us. And in that moment, Michael understood, miracles don't always look like lightning and thunder. Sometimes, they sound like a quiet breath returning. Sometimes, they look like a hand being held. And sometimes, there's simply a heart learning to trust again. Faith is not proof, it's presence. It's the unseen hand that steadies us when reason has no answers. It's the whisper that says, keep believing, even when the outcome is uncertain. Thomas's story wasn't about escaping death. It was about discovering life, the kind of life that begins when a soul finally says, Lord, not my will, but yours. So if you ever find yourself at the edge of hope, staring into the quiet, wondering if your prayer still matters, remember this. God hears what your heart can't even say. And sometimes, the answer isn't changing the situation, it's changing you. And maybe, that's how God reminds us we're never really alone.